Hey everyone, continuing a review of articles from the Boston Consulting Group on strategy. Wonderful book, heard about it on the Tim Ferriss show from a gentleman named Richard Koch. So I'm just reading articles from it kind of one at a time and trying to find parallels from today's business world. And the article I'm reading tonight is Strategy and the New Economics of Information by Philip B. Evans and Thomas S. Wurster. This is 1997. So take you back to 1997. This was Amazon had just gone public and was nowhere near the size that it is today. The internet, the first internet wave was on. No real gigantic successful internet companies yet. A lot of still pets.com and things existing then that would later go bankrupt, especially when 2001 happened, Enron and the recession and all of that. So the interesting thing about this article is it talks about an early disruption due to tech that I think is really interesting that I totally forgot about. And it's Encyclopedia Britannica. So back when I was a kid, if you were studying in school for a subject and you had to write a report, you wouldn't go online, you wouldn't Google it. There was no Wikipedia or anything like that. You had Encyclopedia Britannica, or let me rephrase that. You had an encyclopedia, and that was the way kids did research at home. Otherwise, you have to go to the school library or the public library and grab books and kind of read them, do reports. You had to do that, but a lot of the times you just do your schoolwork. If you had to look something up, it would be through the Encyclopedia Britannica. So, and I keep saying Encyclopedia Britannica because that was the most popular, or that was probably the most famous one. We actually had Funk and Wagnalls, which is mentioned in here as well. That was the cheap one you got at the grocery store. Encyclopedia Britannica was the high-end one, and I forgot this, but they said it sold in the region of $1,500 to $2,000 for a set, and there were a set of 20 plus books, and alphabetical order, and you'd find different topics in them. So I assume the range there was the more complete, obviously, the more you paid. So what they talked about in this article is that your competition in any given industry is not necessarily your direct competitor. Encyclopedia Britannica is one company. Funk and Wagnalls was another. Funk and Wagnalls was sold in the grocery store. That's what my parents got because they were economical. And Encyclopedia Britannica, it had a whole slew of salespeople who go door to door. Encyclopedia Britannica, it looked better. It was more complete, better information, better pictures, better in every respect. So this is your classic example of your strategy in terms of business. You may be high end and you may charge more. Think of Mercedes-Benz in cars compared to your Ford Focus or your whatever low end car you want. That would be your Funk and Wagnalls. Funk and Wagnalls, they sell them in grocery stores. There's no sales staff. They're cheaper. They probably break faster. Not as well written, not as high quality, but it'll serve the purpose. And Encyclopedia Britannica you're getting because you want to put it on your shelf and have everyone know that you have the high-end book. Funk and Wagnalls you're getting because maybe you can't afford it, or maybe you just want your kids to have an encyclopedia and that's it. So they talk about, in this article, always know that your competition may not necessarily be your industry. So in this case, they talk about the competition to Encyclopedia Britannica did not end up being Funk and Wagnalls. It ended up being the personal computer. So I'll explain. So in the early '90s, the personal computer became more and more popular and in more and more homes. So we had one. I bet we got one as early as 1990. There was an Apple IIc. But obviously, Microsoft in the PC world was selling. They began to sell Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, all of their different products, and they would sell them as bundles and discs that you would get with a new computer you bought, a new PC. So whatever PC sellers there were, back then, and I'm gonna get this wrong, but I assume your IBMs, your Dells, whatever was happening back then, would have bundles that they would get from that Microsoft would publish, and Microsoft would get a portion of the computer sales, and they'd give a discount bundle of their services, and then hopefully, people would buy Microsoft Word and Excel because they already had some exposure to Microsoft products. So one of the products Microsoft did, and I totally forgot this because you wouldn't even think about this nowadays, but Microsoft Encarta was a CD-ROM that had an encyclopedia on it. So you buy your computer and you are with it getting a CD of Encarta, and Encarta would sell by itself. If your computer didn't come with the package that included Encarta, you could buy it for $50. So 25 or 2,200 or whatever it was for Encyclopedia Britannica, $50 for Microsoft Encarta. Think about that. A lot of people are going to go with the CD-ROM because what the article talks about, what people were really buying was success for their kids. And what that used to come in was having an encyclopedia in your house because your kids had a chance to, do well in school. That was kind of a status symbol of, hey, I care about my kids and I want them to do well in school. Well, eventually that status symbol became the computer. And suddenly, do you buy a computer they were expensive back then. Probably, I'm guessing, 2000 was the low price, and then they would go up from there, and it obviously came down over time. But if you're spending that much for a computer, you're not going to also spend that much for a set of encyclopedias when you just buy the set for $50 on your computer. What's interesting is they mentioned that Funk and Wagnalls, remember them, they're the cheap version of those sold in grocery stores, among other places. They suddenly partnered with Microsoft to produce the content for Microsoft Encarta, and presumably out of that $50, they got $10 or whatever they got, and it was sold over and over and over and over. And suddenly, Encyclopedia Britannica is in a world of hurt because they have no way to compete against this. I suppose, maybe they could have made it even more high end and sold for $5,000 and tried to, really sell less, but sell for, distinguish themselves on price and quality even more. I don't know whether that would have worked, but the reality is they essentially ended up, going out of business and then eventually turning into an online brand for a while, but you don't hear about them anymore other than I would know about it because I'm old. So it's an interesting article from the perspective of it shows, your competition is not always your direct competition, especially as it pertains to tech. And I want to talk about a specific industry right now that I was thinking about because I read an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about Ant, which I had no idea what the heck Ant was. But Ant is I assume it's a subsidiary or what the Chinese equivalent is of Alibaba. And it started as Alibaba's escrow service when they started. So someone would buy, someone would sell, Ant would provide the escrow so buyers and sellers could trust each other. And it grew from there into a purchasing system for Alibaba. Just like with Amazon, you have your card on file, you buy things through Amazon, transactions are cleared. Similar thing for Ant. And then Ant eventually had people hold money within Ant so they could, receive money by selling something and buy within Alibaba for something else. And then eventually Ant turned into something where it would actually lend money to people on credit. In China, there's not credit cards to the same extent that there is in the US. So look at what Ant is doing over time. It's providing escrow services first. It's providing, holding of funds. It even developed, it's one of the world's largest money market accounts, which is interesting. So it can pay interest to people who have money on file, and it's lending. Well, when you take in money and you pay out interest on that money and you're lending that money, what does that sound a whole hell of a lot like? It's a bank. And what's interesting is the article talks about how, Ant over the last few years has really repositioned itself as a tech company because it's drawn so much scrutiny from the old banking system in China, which the Chinese banking system would be nowhere near as robust as the US, but still the old Chinese banks would have a big incentive to go, wait a minute, we don't want this Ant company that's attached to Alibaba coming in there and running all the financial transactions. That should go through us. But it's interesting that, the banks, their competition was not another bank doing banking better. It was an escrow service for Alibaba that eventually turned into a bank and is really taking over the banking industry in China. So let's take that to US equivalents. What sounds a lot like that? And this is what I was thinking of as soon as I read the escrow service. Well, eBay early on had escrow services. eBay early on purchased PayPal, right, as a payment system. And if you think about it, when eBay first started, it was a pain to do transactions within eBay, and that's why they eventually bought a company like PayPal so they could make transactions a lot easier. PayPal is essentially like a banking system. You keep money in there, and you keep it on PayPal, and then you may send PayPal via email to people nowadays. You may pay for things via PayPal, and even look at Venmo. Venmo is a bank in and of itself, right? You take in money in Venmo, you send money, you attach it to your bank account to send money in and out. Do you know how Venmo makes money? It's really interesting. Like, hopefully when you take money in Venmo, when you send it to your bank, you choose the option that says 1 to 3 days for free. Well, if you look to the left, there's an option to get it instant for, I think it's 10% of the transaction or something like that, up to $10, or maybe it's 7% up to $10, but it's an insane amount. And what's interesting, I was talking to some people who work for a company it's not Venmo, but a similar type of thing where it takes money in and allows people to rapidly send it to their bank account if they want. And they said about 70% of their transactions are the rapid option, where they're essentially getting 10% of the funds that are going up to a $10 limit or whatever it is. I doubt it's 70% with Venmo, and I doubt they even have that published what it is. But I bet it's a lot. I bet it's over 25%. And if you imagine the sheer volume of money going through Venmo, think of all those transactions. And now think back to, what are the complaints about banks, especially with Dodd-Frank's? The fees with debit transactions, overdraft fees, all of that. Well, that's nothing compared to, Venmo and other similar fintech companies that are in that line of business. The difference is, with Venmo, it's totally by choice, right? So, you got your PayPals, your Venmos, you got Ant in China. There's also things like fintech companies that are running as fronts for banks. For instance, I use a online banking tool called Simple, and I call it an online banking tool. It's not a bank because my actual money is at BBVA Compass, but Simple is an easy way to send money there that I keep for savings. They give above rate interest. I assume that they're getting money on the exchange fees every time I use a debit card, which I don't use their debit card very much. I just store money there. But I assume other people use a debit card. I assume that, BBVA Compass, in exchange for Simple directing money there, gives them a cut, of the money they have on there as interest. It's real interesting, like how many of these direct competition things, direct competitors to banks that are out there now. Simple, Venmo, they obviously partner with banks because you can take money in from your bank and you can send money back to your bank. And we're still at this point in banking transactions. But 10 years from now, man, I really see the Wells Fargos of the world and the Chases of the world losing to these fintech companies. Why? A big part of it is Encyclopedia Britannica. One of the reasons they had to keep their prices so high was their distribution network was a large force of well-paid salespeople all over the country, door to door, selling directly to colleges, elementary schools, things like that. It's infrastructure that now tech companies often don't have. If you think about Microsoft Encarta, the article said it cost $1.50 to make that disk with Encarta on it. I don't know if that includes the license to Funk and Wagnalls. I assume that was more, but it was extremely cheap to distribute encyclopedias. And one of the things the article talks about is the contrast between richness and reach. So they had it on kind of a XY type chart. You'll as you go up in richness, meaning quality, a lot of the times it's much harder to distribute it. So in Encyclopedia Britannica's case, it was very rich. I mean, it had a great deal of depth. It was really nicely printed, but it required a very expensive sales staff to get it out there. There wasn't much distribution. Encarta, on the other hand, focused on reach, and it wasn't as quality at all. I mean, it was Funk and Wagnalls, which wasn't as good of a content. It said it added some pictures and things like that, but nowhere near as good as the Encyclopedia Britannica. But the reach was so good. So, as you think about your business and what your distribution efforts are going to be, one thing you got to take into account is, if you're an extremely rich product, meaning high end, very good, it's going to cost a lot of money to get it out there. And you need to make sure that your competition isn't going to be able to beat you on reach. And you may have a strong enough brand name where that won't be the case. For instance, luxury clothing brands, Louis Vuitton purses, they're not going to get beat out just because someone can make cheaper purses and use tech to get a great distribution network because of the brand. But Encyclopedia Britannica was a really strong brand back in the day too. So getting back to banks, well, banks, you got some strong brands. You got your Chases, your Wells Fargos, your Bank of Americas. What is their reach? They got to have all of these expensive distribution networks called branches, and they're starting to shut down a lot of them. I think that's smart, and trying to go to more of an online presence because they're trying to increase their reach, because the richness of the banking experience at physical locations, it doesn't exist as much today, especially not even people my age. I don't want to go into a bank, other than I do get cashier's checks and send wires out of a bank, but that's about it. And you could do that stuff online. So banking is really interesting. And a lot of these fintech companies, I think, especially as they're able to do ventures with online retailing, online shopping, you're going to be able to see some interesting, disruptive fintech products that I think are going to take over the banking world. It wouldn't surprise me if, Venmo, or even Uber's an example. Uber has a ton of money because, right, you pay Uber and they keep the money before they pay out the driver, and they keep their profit on top of that. Uber is a banking system. Will Uber start doing mortgages? Will Venmo start doing mortgages? Will Uber start, offering interest on money you keep with them in order to pay for your rides down the road? Well, who knows? Find out. You think about this critically, and I think banks have really got to figure out how to increase their reach, even at the expense of their richness, and ratchet down their physical locations even more, and ratchet down their high priced distribution staff. I used to be in banking, earned a great salary doing it. So I don't know if they're going to be able to compete with getting capital cheaply when Venmo, everyone's using it to pay people. Uber, everyone's using it as a taxi, and they can double as banks. So I think you're going to see a lot of these, just like you got Alibaba and you got Ant right next to it. I think you're going to see a lot more of these fintech bank type companies that are going to be real disruptive to traditional banks over time. It'll be interesting to see what everything looks like 10 years from now. Thanks, and have a great night.